let's start. My
All right.
first question, maybe you have already seen my questions I sent to Terry. Yes. My first question is, can you explain in a few words what a lean startup is?
And so a lean startup is a way for people doing new ventures, whether inside a large company or as a new venture, to reduce risk by actually searching for all the components of a business model. In the old days, we just used to assume that if we wrote down our idea and wrote a sales forecast, all we needed to do was execute the process. That is, hire people, build the product, hire salespeople, and then people would buy it. And most of those new ventures failed. And they failed, we used to believe, because the people weren't any good. And part of that might be true, but in reality we failed because we were assuming that those things we wrote down were actually true, when in fact they were actually hypotheses, which is a fancy word for guesses. So the problem in the 20th century is we were mostly guessing about all the components of what's called the business model. Who were the customers? What did they want? What features? How should I price it? Who are the competitors? What's the distribution channel? And so the lean startup was a way to kind of reduce risk by actually testing those hypotheses very early. And it has three parts to it. Number one is, let's get out of the building and talk to people and talk to regulators and distribution channel with a formal process called customer development. First part of that is customer discovery. That was my contribution to lean. The second part of lean is, well, while we're out there, why don't we test something called minimum viable products? Think of them as iterative and interactive iterative prototypes. And someone named Eric Ries came up with that idea that said, gee, agile engineering is a great partner to customer development. And then the third part of lean was, well, what exactly are the hypotheses we're testing? And we could kind of figure out we should test the product and test something else. But someone named Alexander Osterwalder came up with something called the business model canvas. And it's a single piece of paper that has 9 key, what I call hypotheses about what makes up a viable business. And so now we use the canvas as kind of our roadmap of why we're outside the building and what it is we're building iterative and incremental minimum viable products for. So to answer your question, lean consists of 3 components: customer development, agile engineering, and business model design, or using a business model canvas.
Okay, this question is not in my list, but you see similarities with a lean manufacturing system of Toyota that changed in the 90s the way the big industries work. But which are these similarities? The Toyota system was a team working in team. And is there any similarity to this aspect of the lean manufacturing?
So when Eric Ries wrote the book, The Lean Startup, that was the analogy he used to kind of describe lean. I wouldn't use that analogy. That's not a model that, I mean, it's nice. They both have the word lean in them, but I think they're kind of different. You know, this is a process that is actually based on efficiency of time and money and resources, not how to improve quality, but how to move rapidly. You know, the customer development process came from my experience as a serial entrepreneur, when in fact the gun to your head was what was called burn rate. Back then, cash was at a minimum, and so we had to figure out how to rapidly make decisions within a constrained environment. Lean manufacturing doesn't have a constrained environment. So, as I said, I guess I would not have picked that analogy to use.
Yes. Second question, what are some of the key traits of successful entrepreneurs?
Well, at the end is whether they made a lot of money. It's always easy to kind of figure it out at the end. They're either very lucky, me, or they were very smart. But I think you're asking in the beginning, what are the key traits? And I think people have kind of articulated over the last 25 years some of the important ones. One is, are they agile? Are they resilient, which means can they get up after off the ground after they fail? Are they tenacious, meaning will they chase something for a long time, and particularly when other people are telling them it's a stupid idea or this will never work? One of the traits that's not described often, though I found certainly with myself and others, are they curious about a lot of things, not just their domain? That is, do they see patterns in other places as well? Do they have good pattern recognition skills? And the one that Steve Jobs kind of coined, which I find actually true, is, do they have a reality distortion field? That is, can they create the ability to get other people to join when it's only them and sitting in an empty building? Can they get investors to give them money when it's only a set of slides? Can they get customers to give them, an order when it's only like a piece of paper and a data sheet? So agility, tenacity, resilience, curiosity, reality, distortion field, and finally a profound belief in what they're doing. Nowadays, with money so available, which is different in different times because this is cyclical, some people will do startups as kind of like, well, it's a job. Well, if you're a founder, I've always felt that the best way to approach it is that it's a calling, not a job. Founders are closer to artists than any other profession. They see things that other people don't. They hear things that other people don't. And their passion, and I guess that's the other component, their passion is what drives them through all the travails of building an early stage venture. And without that passion and vision, it's a job. And I found that's the world's worst way to approach what could be the world's most miserable job, but it's the world's best calling.
Third question, which industries do you think will next see disrupted by startups?
Well, I think the real question is, which industry is not going to be disrupted by startups? And understand that startups are actually a manifestation of disruption. Startups are not disrupting the industry. It's the changes available that smart entrepreneurs say, well, the technology has changed, or the market has changed, or something else has changed, so let me start a company and take advantage of these changes. Uber and Airbnb, didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of the ability of, everybody's now carrying these smart devices that are networked together, and I could build a new business model. Or Amazon happened not because they invented a lot of technology, but they actually understood the power of the internet and to disrupt channels. So it's even in the oil business. One looks at what happened in the last just only 10 years in the United States. You would say, well, how disruptive could oil be? You put a hole in the ground and you suck oil out. Turns out the disruption there was in something called fracking in the United States. The U.S. now pumps more oil than Saudi Arabia. It's the largest oil producer in the world. That was disruptive to the entire oil industry on a technology shift and also a regulatory shift in the United States. So to answer your question, I don't think there is a single business or market in the 21st century that isn't going to be disrupted by changes in technology or regulation or other pieces of technology enabling new things. And as long as startups are around, and as long as they're in a country that incents innovation and doesn't strangle it, which is another question, is you may not ask, but I'll answer it already. Innovation thrives in places that allows it, and it dies in places that kills it. There are countries where corruption is fairly high. Innovators don't thrive in those environments because they get strangled in their crib. So the answer to the question is, innovation will happen everywhere. 21st century is going to be a pretty amazing time. It's going to spin your head around. The world will look nothing like it looked like when we were young.
Yes, yes, you have partly answered to the fourth. What key things go into making a successful startup? Is it advanced technology or something else? You have told something about that. Yes.
So, people think of at times of startups being technology driven, and yes, sometimes that's true. It's the new inventions or better versions of new, faster microprocessors, etc. Sometimes it's just an observation that the world has changed around you, or that cultural changes have happened, or that Brexit has happened, or something else has happened, and that there's a way here to kind of arbitrage those changes into something profitable. And the other thing to think about is kind of the categories of innovation, and this came from McKinsey about 30 years ago. They kind of categorized them as 3 horizons of innovation. Horizon 1 being incremental innovation. Horizon 2, maybe you're taking existing technology or resources and repurposing it somewhere else. Horizon 3 being really disruptive innovation, and so those 3 buckets are kind of interesting to think about. I used to call them existing markets, resegmented, and new, but it's the same idea, and the idea is that's changed is it used to be disruption required new technologies. As I said in the examples I used, Uber and Airbnb did not invent any new technologies. They, in fact, were incredibly disruptive because they were able to understand that there was an enabler out there that could completely destroy existing markets, but they did not invent technology. They invented a new business model. So business model innovation could be as powerful as 10 years of R&D for a new drug.
Yes. Fifth question: How has funding for startups changed over the years? What should founders keep in mind when trying to get funded?
Oh, you're asking the question to someone who's living in the craziest part of the world in terms of funding. So it's not true everywhere. So funding is not level across the world. In Silicon Valley, you could raise hundreds of millions of dollars. In some place in small town in Italy, that exceeds the entire country's gross, or the region's gross national product. So number one is to recognize that while innovation is everywhere, innovation is everywhere, and for the first time in the history of the world, the internet has allowed innovation tools and ideas to be everywhere. You could be sitting in any country, any village, any whatever, and know more than I did about entrepreneurship sitting in Silicon Valley when I started my career. That's a radical change. But what's not changed is capital, meaning money, is still concentrated in maybe 10 areas in the world. Maybe not more than 10. And I don't mean a seed round, an early round to start. I mean, if you want tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to scale your company, you have to be headquartered, or at least part of your company needs to be in one of those 10 areas. And it's just like, maybe not much different than other businesses. There are clusters, that is, concentrated areas of innovation for other technology areas. If you want to build automobiles, there's probably only 10 places in the world you go. Back then, if you wanted to be in the leather business, there were only a couple places in Italy you would go. If you wanted to build, etc. So the answer is, you could start your startup probably in any country or region, and probably in most countries there are places you could raise early stage capital, which is a fancy word to say you could get money from angel investors, your cousins, your friends, or maybe some professionals who will give you small checks. But to scale, to get very large, there's still kind of clusters of innovation that you need to go to. Did I answer your question?
Yes. The sixth is about what are the important obstacles that entrepreneurs face in trying to start a company outside of the US. You have said something about that, but how important is it to have an appetite for embracing risk and failure?
Yeah, so in Silicon Valley, and I think in other entrepreneurial clusters, we have a special word in English for a failed entrepreneur. Do you know what that word is? For a failed entrepreneur? Experienced. Yeah, but that kind of embraces this notion of risk. You know, most entrepreneurs fail. It's a big idea. Most of them fail. And here, if you fail, and if it's an honest failure, you go to coffee with your friend after you failed, and their first question is not, do you have to change your name or do you have to leave town? Their first question is, so what are you going to do next? What's your next startup? That's kind of, and so working in that environment allows you to take multiple shots at the goal. It's a big idea. It's like would be playing football and only having one shot at the goal. You know, that's not how we play the game. Here we play the game that says, why, of course, it's not. Yes, it's failure, but we assumed you've learned quite a bit, and that the next time you're not going to make those mistakes. So, in regions that don't have that that risk-tolerant culture, you kind of strangle innovation by depressing the number of times someone will actually attempt to do that, and then you get a culture where people kind of say, well, get a permanent job, and by the way, the other thing that heavily influences that is what your parents think and how close to them do you live. It's a big idea. If in fact you're doing a startup in a culture that doesn't appreciate entrepreneurship and your parents are nearby, that social pressure will force a good number of those entrepreneurs away from doing risky ventures because it will look badly on the family, which is why in the United States, Silicon Valley got started in a place where most people weren't born. Most people were born on the East Coast of the United States, so they went to California to kind of do this. It's why entrepreneurship for the first 2 decades flourished in Silicon Valley and did not flourish in Boston, which is where it should have started. Did that answer your question?
Yes. I think you have answered to the seventh too, because the seventh was what are the best ways to educate people about entrepreneurship. Is the what you said is an answer, I think.
Yeah. So the notion is that entrepreneurship fails sometimes because the people are not smart or not good. But it mostly fails because we, have the wrong set of hypotheses. And that's like running a science experiment in a lab. The analogy I used is of taking one shot at a goal at football, but it would also be like having scientists only be allowed to run one experiment, and then you fire them. Well, science would never move forward. So doing a startup is kind of like a science experiment. You're running multiple experiments, and some of them will work and some of them won't. Or my analogy earlier of like having an artist and only allowing them to paint one painting, and if it's not the Last Supper or Michelangelo's David, we fire them. Well, we would never have any art. This is very different than businesses that are repeatable and known with known structures, etc. And we've done a bad job of educating everybody between the distinction between the two. That is, these are very different. One's a job, but the other's not a job. The other is art. And we have done a bad job in executing the people who have jobs what these other people are doing. And we've done a bad job explaining to the artist how to reduce risk and why it's different than a job. So we could do a better job in doing that. In clusters, people have kind of figured that out, but still haven't articulated that to each other. They just know they're in a space where everybody is an artist and it feels a lot more comfortable.
Yes, in Tuscany there is a very strong discussion about the role of a regional government, in general public institutions, in order to enhance resources and investments for startups. What do you think about it? Which would be this role of regional government a public institution in improving startups or in
Wait a minute, the government in Tuscany wants to help startups?
Yes? The government is very interested in startups.
I'm coming. I'm going to be there because I've been to Tuscany.
It doesn't know the right ways, and this is the reason why I interview you.
Tell them I'm coming. I love Tuscany. I just need a small villa, and my wife and I will move there for a couple of months every year to help the government. Tell them that's all.
Suggest.
Make that suggestion. If anybody from the government is watching, just invite me. We're coming. So number one. There is a question of whether you can engineer an entrepreneurial cluster. Can you build one? Right? That's the first question one should ask. Is it even possible to do this? Or are these all lucky accidents? So it's interesting to look at the history of entrepreneurial clusters and realize Silicon Valley and Boston in the U.S. were accidents. But there have been engineered clusters, meaning built by design, across the world. Herzliya, that is outside of Tel Aviv in Israel, was engineered brilliantly by the Israeli government. Beijing and the clusters around Shenzhen and other places in China were engineered by the Chinese government. And Singapore has perpetually reinvented themselves in different, not just technology, but for the last 50 or so years has done also the best examples. Other places have tried and failed, the jury is still out. Chile has tried a lot. Finland has tried a lot. And so the first thing I would suggest to the local government is, yes, it's possible. The other latest example in the United States is the mayor of New York City at the time, Michael Bloomberg, took New York from nothing to an engineered cluster that he personally and the city engineered in an extremely short period of time. So the first question to the civic leaders in Tuscany is, go up to a whiteboard and explain to me what they did, how they did it, how much money they needed, and what did they invest in to make it work, and by the way, use the examples of the ones that didn't work. And it is possible to do this. The second thing they need to understand, which might make them depressed, is that it will not happen in their time that they are in the government. Meaning, most elected officials want to have something show up while they're still mayor or regional governor or something else. That's not how, it doesn't happen in 2 years. It might happen in 10. And so if you understand that, it could be your legacy, but it will not get you reelected. So does that help? But it is possible to engineer this. And again, when you said Tuscany, I at first I was laughing when you said Italy, and then I said, when you said Tuscany, immediately you could think about the types of resources that Tuscany has. I mean, beautiful location, whatever. But what else would it need to attract? So here's the other piece. This is the one piece of good advice for local officials, is that almost every cluster that succeeds not because it's a jobs program for the local populace. It succeeds, it's because it becomes a magnet, an attractor for the best and the brightest in your region or country. That's what you want to build, is how do we get incredibly smart people from all around Italy to come to Tuscany who will support the local economy, but this is not a jobs program for the existing people on day one. Does that make sense?
Okay. So the third pillar of innovation is the research centers. Are the research centers? What role should university and research centers play in creating a thriving startup ecosystem?
That's a great question. So, in Silicon Valley, Stanford University was kind of the center of this explosion, and the reason why is that there was a a single professor who became the provost of the university, who turned what was a pretty good research university into an outward-facing university. That is, most universities face inward. That is, they focus on their own research, their own politics, their own whatever, and everything outside those walls, that's not our job, that's not our business, that's not whatever. That's fine for the university, but it doesn't create an ecosystem. If, in fact, that you have universities and local research centers now realizing, well, yes, we not only need to teach it inside, but we need to connect to companies and local government and other resources, that's when the university actually acts as a catalyst rather than this walled garden over here. And you could see the differences in the history of innovation clusters. And it only takes one or two key people in a university to make it happen. Usually the president or the provost who understands that they really could have an effect on this ecosystem.
Sí. Yes, my next question. Next question is very long, but I can reduce in this class, which will be the impact of the startups flourishing on the job market, on the labor market.
Again, let me start with the place where I've lived for the last 40 years, which is Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley, believe it or not, used to be an agricultural area. I mean, well, it's south of San Francisco. We used to grow fruit here. I mean, so talking about transformation, no one thinks of this as the fruit capital of the United States, but it was before it became Silicon Valley. So the transformation could be substantive because it became, as I said, a magnet, an attractor. It was the best and the brightest ended up coming here, or maybe Boston or different, depending on the industry. Just like Hollywood near Los Angeles. Those were orange fields. They were orchards. Now, if you wanted to make movies or whatever, there was one place in the world that you went to, and it became a cluster for entertainment. So it could transform a region. And you have to decide that that's a transformation you would like. In New York, it didn't overpower the region because New York had other specialties of finance and real estate and media. But now you would add innovation and entrepreneurship to one of the verticals that New York City also does. So it could be that Tuscany is known for the things it's already known, but wouldn't it be great if it was also known as the region in Italy that world-class entrepreneurs ended up with? I think that would be very cool.
Yes. My last question is very interesting for me, for my job, because about the possibility to create startups in journalism. The question sounds so. From certain points of view, my online newspaper is still a startup, since we have not yet found a productive profit model. Do you see any profit-making options for online newspapers, which are not as big as, for example, the New York Times? Are there favorable conditions for new startups in journalism?
Yeah, in the United States, there's emerging new markets for news. Most of them are online newsletters rather than print publications, and so that's one change is, and two is what they tend to do is sell conferences or data or resources to complement their business. And actually, I haven't seen the economics, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was where most of their profits were generated. And it's very funny. It feels a lot like the railroads in the United States in the 1800s. And I'll give you the analogy. When we started building railroads across our country, which was fairly large, people thought, they're going to make money by transporting passengers and goods, and some of them did. But the real smart ones bought up land on either side of the railroads, or was granted land, and they actually made money selling real estate. So sometimes the business model is a little more complicated than let me get money from subscribers or paying customers. If you remember, the old newspaper model was you didn't really make money from the subscriptions or the people buying the paper. You made money from advertising. And so the new the new challenge for people providing news is, well, since advertising is now free, what are the other sources of revenue that I will use to support my news? And that's an interesting question. I think the jury is out about what's the right model, but I've seen lots of people experimenting in different ways. But you have to think about what's the new substitute for advertising as a revenue base for providing information.
Yes. My last question is a joke one. Joke. How do you feel as the godfather of Silicon Valley?
I am the least likely person to be the godfather of Silicon Valley, but I find it amusing because I had never had any intent to both end up as a professor at Stanford, or I was just an entrepreneur who did startups because I loved learning new things. I could not imagine I was getting paid to learn about supercomputers or microprocessors or things I knew nothing about. And so I think it's just an interesting story for other young entrepreneurs is follow your passion. Follow what you're interested in. And whatever you do it well, and you'll end up as the godfather of something.
So thank you very, very much, Ms. Blank, for this interview.